Alright, let's talk about something that keeps resurfacing in the XRP world. And every time it does, it creates exactly the same emotional reaction. A headline drops, Twitter lights up, people start tagging each other, and suddenly it feels like we've been dragged straight back into a place that most XRP holders never want to revisit. This week, it was the familiar question all over again. Is the Ripple lawsuit coming back? Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. I'm Paula. On this channel, we don't do hype cycles or panic reactions. What we do instead is slow things down, look at incentives, regulation, and structure, and try to understand what's actually happening underneath the headlines, especially in moments like this, where emotion tends to run ahead of reality. Because on the surface, this story did look serious. There was a letter from the House of Democrats criticising the SEC for dropping major crypto cases. Ripple's name was mentioned alongside companies like Coinbase, Binance, and Kraken. And almost immediately that turned into speculation that the SEC could somehow be pressured into reopening cases, including Ripple's. And if you've held XRP through the last 5 years, that kind of headline doesn't just feel abstract. It hits straight in the gut because nobody wants to relive that period of uncertainty, exchange delistings, and constant legal anxiety. So the first thing we need to do here is slow this right down and separate what feels scary from what is actually possible. Because legally, the idea that the SEC can simply reopen the Ripple case just isn't how the system works. Because once a case has been decided by court, those same parties cannot be dragged back into the courtroom over the same issue again. It doesn't matter how angry politicians are, how loud social media gets, or who is running the SEC at any given moment. Political pressure does not override settled law. That's why legal commentators like Bill Morgan were so dismissive of this idea almost immediately. Not because they were downplaying the importance of regulation, but because they understand the difference between political theatre and legal reality. The Ripple case is over. That chapter is closed. And it's important to say that clearly, because a lot of the anxiety we saw this week was built on something that simply cannot happen. But here's where it gets more interesting and also more frustrating. Even though the lawsuit itself is finished, it still feels like XRP is stuck in limbo. And that feeling isn't imagined. It exists because the lawsuit was never the only problem. What Ripple won in court was judicial clarity, but what the US still doesn't have is statutory clarity. There are still no clear laws that properly define what different types of crypto assets are, how they should be regulated, and how they fit into the broader financial system. And that gap between court rulings and actual legislation is where all the frustration lies. That's where the Clarity Act comes in, and why this week actually matters far more than the lawsuit headlines ever did. The Clarity Act was supposed to be the next step, the piece of legislation that finally gives the US a proper market structure framework for crypto. But this week, that process was paused, not cancelled, not rejected, but delayed. And the reason for that delay was Coinbase raising objections to parts of the draft. This is the moment where things can very easily slide into conspiracy territory if you're not careful. So it's really important to frame this properly. Coinbase didn't block the Clarity Act because they hate Ripple. And they didn't secretly sabotage XRP behind closed doors. What happened is much more boring and much more realistic than that. Coinbase acted in its own commercial interest, the same way every large company does when regulation is being written. Coinbase and Ripple are not direct competitors. They don't sell the same product, and they're not fighting for the same customers in a simple sense. But they do have very different business models, and those models naturally push them to want different things from regulation. Coinbase is an exchange. Its business depends on trading, custody, and intermediation, and it benefits from regulatory frameworks that centre exchanges as the main gatekeepers of crypto markets. Ripple, on the other hand, is infrastructure. Its focus is on settlement, liquidity, and payments. And what it needs most is clarity at the token level, especially for assets like XRP. Those incentives don't perfectly align, and they don't have to. That doesn't make Coinbase a villain or Ripple a victim. It simply means that when laws are being written, different players lobby for language that suits their own business models. And sometimes that slows things down for others. So instead of asking whether Coinbase is deliberately holding Ripple back, the more honest and useful question is, who benefits from delay? Because delays preserve the status quo, protect incumbents, and reduce pressure to adapt while lawmakers go back and forth trying to reconcile competing interests. What makes this whole situation particularly interesting is that while all of this is happening in the US, Ripple hasn't been sitting still. One of the biggest shifts over the last couple of years is that US clarity is no longer existential for Ripple in a way it once was. 5 years ago, everything hinged on that lawsuit. Today, Ripple is building globally in jurisdictions where rules already exist. They've been expanding in the UK, engaging with regulators in Europe under MiCA, growing payment corridors in the Middle East, and strengthening liquidity routes across Asia Pacific. They've secured licenses, partnered with banks, and continued developing real settlement use cases using XRP. And that changes the entire context of this story, because it means the US is no longer the sole centre of gravity. You can see that shift most clearly when you look at what's been happening in South Korea. XRP has always had a strong presence there, partly because Korea operates spot-only crypto markets, and partly because retail participation is high and regulatory frameworks are clearer in practice. Recently, XRP trading volume surged again on Korean exchanges, and a lot of people interpreted that as a sudden wave of speculation buy-in. But that framing misses the point. This isn't about Korea randomly pumping XRP. It's about the fact that XRP trades differently in different regulatory environments. Where rules are clearer and markets are structured in a way that allows liquidity to flow freely, XRP behaves like a mature asset. Where rules are uncertain and politics dominate the conversation, it stagnates. And this is also where it's worth talking about how people are actually navigating this market in practice. Because another frustration I hear all the time is that XRP hasn't had huge price swings. So it feels like there's nothing to do but wait. That's understandable, because people associate opportunity with explosive moves. But even without massive breakouts, there's been enough movement in XRP for money to be made, not just in a simple buy and forget way. In markets like this, where price is range bound and driven more by liquidity and regional flows than big headlines, execution, fees, and risk management matter far more than hype. That's why when I'm actively trading XRP rather than just holding it, I use Blowfin. I've found that even though we haven't seen dramatic price swings, there's been enough intraday and multi-day movement to trade consistently if you're patient and structured. Blowfin's futures platforms gives me that flexibility to do that without overcommitting and without feeling like fees and friction are eating into everything I make. This actually ties in really well with something Blowfin has just launched specifically for my community, which is a new deposit and trading rewards campaign. I wouldn't bring this up if it didn't genuinely fit the market conditions we're in, because this isn't about promising huge upside. It's about making trading more efficient in a slower, politically driven environment. The bonuses can be used to offset trading fees, funding fees, and even a portion of losses, which matters far more than people realise when markets are chopping sideways and capital preservation becomes the priority. For me, this fits exactly with how I've been approaching XRP lately. I'm not trying to force a narrative or overtrade. I'm simply working with the ranges the market is giving, managing risk carefully, and using a platform that supports that approach rather than working against it. If you want to look into it, I've put my Blowfin link in the description so you can see the full details of the campaign, including the deposit tiers and trading bonuses. As always, this isn't financial advice and trading isn't for everyone. But if you are trading XRP in this kind of market, it does make sense to do it on a platform designed for these conditions. And when you zoom back out, this really is the theme of everything we've talked about today. XRP holders are not facing a renewed legal threat, but they are living through a political delay. The Clarity Act hasn't been killed, but it has been slowed. That's frustrating, especially when you know the asset already has court clarity. But it doesn't stop Ripple from operating globally, and it doesn't undo the legal victory that's already been won. This isn't a conspiracy story, and it's not a betrayal narrative. It's a system story. Big companies lobby for their interests. Governments move slowly. Laws take time to reconcile competing priorities. And markets respond to structure rather than emotion. The Ripple lawsuit isn't coming back. The Clarity Act delay is political, not personal. And XRP isn't frozen in time. It's just no longer waiting for the US to decide its future. If you want to understand how we in the Crypto Wolfpack navigate moments like this, not just in bull markets, but in slow, frustrating political ones like this, we've made a completely free course that breaks down the strategies we use to manage uncertainty. You'll find the link in the description below. And as always, if you're holding crypto long term, self-custody matters. I use Tangent personally, and I've linked it below with a community discount. If this helped cut through some of the noise, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Is the US falling behind global crypto adoption, or does it eventually catch up? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.